Starting, are you ready? Our time starts now. Mitigate results. Countries of the world should accept substantially more refugees from the Middle East. The 1951 Refugee Convention defines a refugee as someone who owns a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion, is outside the country of his nationality, and is able to or owing to such fear unwilling to avail himself to the protection of that country. According to Ganó CON, writing for the Max Planck Encyclopedia of Public International Law, this definition is in practice recognized for the purpose of humanitarian assistance on a worldwide basis. It can be seen as the core of the minimum standard definition for the status of a person as a refugee. The sole contention of the negative case is that the acceptance of refugees threatens the security of the citizens and the nation that accepts them in two main ways. The first is by increasing terrorism. According to The Guardian, in testimony to the Senate Armed Service Committee, U.S. General Philip Breedlove, who is also the Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO Allied Command Operations, said that the Islamic State terror group is spreading like a cancer among the refugees. The group's members are taking advantages of paths of least resistance and threatening European nations and our own, he added. A report by Homeland Security Committee finds that Islamist terrorists are determined to infiltrate refugee flows to enter the West, and appear to have done so already in Europe. In fact, at least one terrorist responsible for the Paris attacks is suspected of having entered Europe through the refugee flows. Also, warnings have been mounting that ISIS is focused on deploying operatives to the West, especially Europe. A French citizen who returned from Syria said that the war zone had become a factory of jihadists trained to hit France and Europe in the very near future, according to a report in recent weeks from France's Justice Ministry. Daniel Feynman of the Brookings Institute states that if they cannot be integrated into local communities, then refugees risk perpetuating or even exacerbating the tensions between Muslim and non-Muslim communities in Europe. Despite the current gratitude for sanctuary in Europe, over time the refugees may be disenfranchised and become alienated. We've seen this before, where anger and disaffection fester, creating suspect communities that do not cooperate with law enforcement and security agencies, and that allow terrorists to recruit and operate with little interference. The impact is an increase in terrorist attacks. Amanda Eki from NYU finds that a 1% increase in the size of a country's refugee population creates a corresponding 18% increase in terrorist attacks committed by groups based in that country. Daniel Milton of Arkansas State University finds in a peer-reviewed 2013 study that when refugee flows change from 25th to the 75th percentile, the expected count of transnational terrorist attacks increases by 91.38%. The second is by leading to backlash. Karen Jacobson, Associate Research Professor at the Fletcher School of Tufts University, explains that refugees impose strains on medical, educational, and municipal facilities, on housing capacity, and on job availability. Jacobson further noting that this strain leads to service breakdowns, increased hardship for existing citizens, and resentment against the refugees. As she explains, this happens because the local population views refugees as receiving preferential treatment. The impacts of this backlash have been massive. According to CNBC, in the German city of Cologne, over 1,700 supporters of right-wing groups gathered to protest in response to the refugees being identified as suspects in assaults on women in New Year's Eve. Some in the crowd threw bottles and firecrackers at officers, and riot police used a water cannon to disperse the protesters. In the end, some people were injured in the clash. Daily Mail reports that in Leipzig, another German city, hundreds of anti-refugee rioters caused chaos after a demonstration where they called for asylum seekers to be deported and their nation's borders closed. The right-wingers broke away from a largely peaceful march in the eastern city to trash the suburb of Koniggwitz. In addition, Russia Today finds that in Hish, a small town in the Netherlands, a mass anti-immigration rally erupted into violence after riot police moved in to disperse a 1,000-strong march against the opening of a refugee center. Protesters shot fireworks and threw flares at riot police who attempted to disperse the crowd. The Associated Press reports that Czech police say online attackers have set a refugee center on fire in the Czech capital of Prague, injuring one person. The European Union furthers that stating that during the first half of 2015, German Interior Ministry recorded 202 attacks on housing for asylum seekers, including attempts to render shelters uninhabitable through arson, attacks with stones, and other vandalism. Thus, we are proud to make a resolution.
You guys ready? Right, I'm going to start. Countries of the world should accept substantially more refugees from the Middle East. Since our opposing side did not provide a framework for today's debate, we believe that the debate should be based off morality, and I'll give you a little bit more in my first contention. Our first contention is, because there is no action of comparable moral significance when taking in refugees from the Middle East, countries of the world are obligated to take in refugees to alleviate their moral suffering. Our first subpoint is Peter Singer's philosophy on decisions through comparable moral significance is explained by his famous analogy. Imagine you come across a child who has fallen into a pond, and you know that you can safely and easily rescue him, but you're wearing a nice pair of shoes, and looking under the table, it looks like you gentlemen have a fine taste in shoes. Now, we all know that saving the child, thus sacrificing your shoes, is the right thing to do. the moral thing to do, unless you are morally monstrous. The only cost of this analogy is the expensive pair of shoes that you would be ruined. But no person would want to compare a child's life with the price of shoes, nor is it possible to compare these two things. Our second subpoint is that refugees are undergoing severe hardships. Therefore, there is no action of comparable moral significance when saving them. John Davidson of the Globe and Mail reports that serious conflict has created over 2.4 million child refugees, and the UN says that more than 450,000 people are under siege right now. Cases of starvation have been reported this year in areas surrounded by government forces. UNICEF said that 400 children were killed in 2015. Accepting refugees can remove them from these war-torn areas to safety. Hence, using philosophy of Peter Singer, countries of the world have a moral obligation to accept refugees because not only can they accept refugees, but they risk nothing that is comparable moral significance when doing this act. Our second contention depends on Rawlsian justice, and that we are obligated to help refugees because justice is fairness. John Rawls depended on the idea that it would be unjust to have people live or die, benefit or suffer because of the lottery of birth. One does not choose what family they'll be born into, rich or poor, like I said. Rawls continues in the theory of justice. In a just society, the liberties of an equal citizenship are taken as settled. The rights secured by justice are not subject to political bargaining or to the calculus of social interests. He continues, principles of justice for the basic structure of society. The principles that free and rational persons concerned to further their own interests would accept in an initial position of equality. Justice as fairness. Thus, we cannot allow for these refugees to suffer, knowing that by the lottery of birth, we are fortunate enough to be in a room today debating this topic when they are going through these hardships right now. There is nothing of moral comparable significance drawing from my first contention that can either fulfill both our contentions. So, onto our contention 3. Is that refugees, the business they are bringing, and their long-term taxable revenue provide economic growth for host countries. In European countries and Japan, they have the capacity to support aging populations. This is why, according to The Guardian, countries who accept more refugees in the EU will have positive economic growth, according to the International Monetary Fund. Countries who already accepted substantial amounts of refugees are experiencing this growth, according to Leon Berditsky of the Bloomberg View. In Turkey, the estimate is 10 billion since 2011. Last year, Syrians funded more than 1,100 companies there. 26% of all new foreign-owned firms, Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan have all seen positive economic growth rates. For the 3 following contentions, we already think that you should affirm. But going on to their first contention, which there's a huge hole in terrorism. When you take in refugees, terrorism does not solve the root problem. If they say that, yes, if you believe them, that when you increase refugees, terrorism also increases. But they're not solving the problem of terrorism when they do this. Also, they give a study talking about the 1 to 18% increase of terrorism, but we have the same card. This card does not show at all where it starts from. It does not say what the 1 is at. When your 1% of terrorism goes up, you don't know the starting number. And for that reason, we urge a pro ballot. Thank you.
First speaker is ready for cross.
Yeah, for sure. Sorry. Do you want the first question?
Yes, we're the first speaker. Okay.
All right.
Sorry. Are governments moral agents?
Yes, I think that governments are moral agents. No. Can I finish, please? Governments are moral agents, but I know what you're about to say. You're going to say that they aren't, but I say they are because government. You're going to say it can only be attained to a single person. But yes, governments are moral agents, but they have different moral obligations than the moral agents that you're about to bring up.
No. I just want to ask you, according to who governments are moral agents? Because you just say, I think. Who says that governments are moral agents?
It's a moral philosophy.
It's a moral philosophy. Okay. How many countries actually accept that their decisions are made morally?
What do you mean?
How many countries actually act morally?
A lot. It's
according to who? What evidence? Because countries act on the best interests of their citizens, of their economic interests, their other interests based on their citizens.
Okay, I agree with that, but that's exactly where our framework.
Okay, for a second. You agree that the duty of the government is to their own citizens?
No, what I was about to say is that if you would like. Pardon?
Go ahead.
Okay, if you're going to think that, judges, think of what we said in morality was governments aren't sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance. There's nothing that these governments are risking when they're taking in the refugees that are compared to lives.
No, they're actually risking the lives of their own citizens. Governments have the duty to protect their own citizens. So, as we established, terrorism. First of all, okay, here's the thing. The refugee flows. There has been evidence that terrorists actually go in through the refugee flows and cause terrorism. Let me finish. Putting in danger the lives of the citizens of their country. Basically, when countries accept refugees, they put in danger their own citizens. They're failing the contract that they have to their own citizens.
Okay, I have a question to go against that. Would you ban tourist visas or student visas?
What?
Would you ban would a country ban tourist or student visas? Because that is another that's another really easy way for terrorists to get into the country. When you're saying banning refugees, when we say that it doesn't solve the problem, it doesn't. Refugees can just as easily get into these countries on student and tourist visas, and they do.
Here's the thing, that even if you buy that tourists actually go through students and other types of visas, countries not accepting substantially more refugees actually solves for the terrorism caused by the refugees. We don't have to solve for every single type of terrorism that occurs because that would be impossible. And I have a question. You talked about the economic growth of the countries that accept refugees. How exactly are the refugees causing this increasing GDP?
Because they're going to these countries and they're working.
What jobs do they have?
We have a card that says that there have been 15,000 doctors, and there's been people of all.
15,000 doctors. Of how many refugees?
I'm not
Of
sure.
millions of refugees.
All these refugees are going into the countries and creating jobs. It's better that they leave the country than
So jobs
staying
are
in a
being-
country that gets
jobs are being
bombed
created
every
for
single
the
day.
refugee- Jobs are being created for the refugees. No. So what jobs do they take?
Is that
No answer.
that's not a question.
Yes, that's the question. I'm asking you.
I'm saying that refugees can easily go into these countries and get jobs. I don't know the exact list of every single job a refugee's ever taken, but I'm saying. Okay.
It's okay.
Okay,
You
we're
have
just gonna
2 minutes
run-
of prep time. You want some?
Yeah, I'll take like 30 seconds.
It's there first.
Oh, sorry.
Judges, are you ready? Opponents? Partner? Okay, so let's start off on my opponent's first contention talking about morality. They give you this analogy of shoes and how governments have a moral obligation to help the refugees. However, first, three general responses. First, there's no justification whatsoever as to why governments have this moral obligation. They just there to tell you there's no significant moral comparison of it. They never tell you why the moral obligation applies to governments. Second, they don't give you any impact whatsoever of not acting morally. And third, and most importantly, there's absolutely no solvency in this entire contention. They just say refugees are passing through hardships. They never give you any evidence of how accepting refugees solves for this. That being said, there's going to be three distinct ways that we're going to delink them entirely from this contention. And the first is that governments are not moral agents. According to Lloyd Gershon from the University of Toronto, a group of human beings, such as a group that comprises a nation, cannot be self-aware and therefore cannot be a moral agent. And if nations are not moral agents, then it's a mistake to suppose that nations have a moral obligation or rights or duties, or that they can bear moral guilt or blame. The second way we're dealing is that governments must always use utilitarianism and not deontology. According to Owen Harris of the National Interest, in politics, the ethics of responsibility rather than the ethics of absolute ends, it is appropriate. Governments must always weigh consequences in the competing claims of other ends. So once they enter the realm of politics, human rights have to take their place in a hierarchy of interests, including national security and the promotion of prosperity. And the third way we deal with their entire contention is that the governments have a duty to their own citizens. According to Sir Paul Stephenson, the former commissioner of the UK Metro Police, government's first duty is to protect the people. Common consensus would have it that the first duty of government is to protect protection of its citizens. Political leaders of the past and present, both nationally and internationally, unite around this understanding. Don't give them absolutely any offense of the first contention. They say that refugees are going through severe hardship. There are 2.4 million child refugees. 450,000 people are under siege. However, again, there's absolutely no solvency for this contention. They just say refugees are going through hardship. They never give you any evidence of how accepting these refugees solves. And ultimately, you're actually going to be turning these arguments. According to Norikov of the World Foundation, the right to due process, asylum, and legal protection are all being denied to refugees in Hungary. According to Alan Hall of the Daily Mail, a culture of rape and sexual abuse is being allowed to take hold in asylum centers across Germany as Europe struggles to cope with their migrant crisis. And then, according to The Guardian, Swedish officials have called for greater security at overcrowded asylum centers a day after the fatal stabbing of an employee at a refugee center for unaccompanied youth. The human rights abuses that they so abhor are not unique to a negative world. Don't let them get away with this offense. Let's go on to my one second talking about Rawls and justice. So Rawls, what he's talking about is that the way governments behave as to their citizens, not in the context of the international community. And then second, if they build this lottery of birth argument, that doesn't mean you should affirm. Just because refugees should not be held accountable for the situation they're in, doesn't mean that countries should take more of them. It just means that they should be held accountable. They say, okay, so let's go on to my point in third contention. They talk about like the business that the refugees are trying to bring in and like how like, there's positive economic growth. So first, let's do the business. They can't quantify how much like refugees are actually bringing in businesses. You can't wait to talk about. And the second, they say positive economic growth. So like first, it's a prediction. Like you can't look to that compared to empirical analysis. And second, just because like countries that have been accepting refugees have had more growth doesn't mean that the refugees caused this growth. Correlation does not imply causation. Don't give them any offense of this. But and then most importantly, let's look to the real world. To the real world. According to the IMF in 2014, the study found an overall negative effect on all economic activity in Jordan. So first, without the conflict, the annual growth rate for 2013 would have been 4% instead of 3%. And then second, inflation rose mainly due to an increase in rental prices as Syrian families were looking for housing. And then third, Jordan's informal sector is likely to have grown because the Syrian refugees who are not legally out to work in Jordan look for employment mainly in the informal sectors. These increased informal activities have adverse consequences for the Jordanian economy, the key of which are like crowding out of Jordanian workers, where Syrian refugees accept lower wages, and loss in tax revenues. Thank you.
Right, you've got 59 seconds of prep. You want some?
Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. So first of all, they attempt to flood us with empiricism while ignoring the basic logic and causal link between them. Their sole contention is that as one that considers the threat of security, yet they fail to weigh the threat of refugees within the country with the threat of increased radicalization outside of the country. And this lack of quantification is why they fail on the framework of cost-benefit analysis that they have already conceded to. Their first source is from The Guardian, and it talks about the spread of refugees and radicalization. However, this idea is corroborated through many of their sources, whether it's the CBC in Cologne, the demonstrations, and the Czech houses on fire. They fail to quantify this with what is actually happening outside to refugees who face radicalization. So they fail to account for the fact that refugees actually face more radicalization. According to the New York Times, as of 2015, the longer refugees are left to languish in despair, the more prone they are to radicalization. Terrorists are adroit at exploiting the most vulnerable who might turn to them for security, justice, and even hope. So this establishes a direct causal link between refugees not being granted this and posing as an increased security threat. So the security threat that they pose outside does not equal the one that they pose within a country. It is much greater. This is continued according to the International Interaction Study by Milton. Large number of refugees placed in countries that have historic conflicts with the refugees is not counteractive, as they have already said. So they say that this constitutes a reason to deny refugees, yet there's a greater threat that is posed when refugees are left to languish outside the country. Now, they look at the impact of terrorism through ECI. We have already said that ECI is a survey that is outdated and does not result in the growth that they have said. They talk about a peer review in Jacobson. Both of these talk about suspected growth based on a model that is not indicative of the true situation. The second is Jacobson, which talks about strains in facilities. This source is about possibility and does not prove anything that has actually happened. Now, they talk about CNBC in Cologne. There's demonstrations in Russia, according to the Daily Mail, and they talk about houses being put on fire. Yet, once again, they fail to quantify this, which is with the alternative. So they continuously say that refugees are bringing all of these harms, yet they say that the true moral imperative resides outside the countries where refugees face far worse situations. They can't say there might be demonstrations, but these demonstrations do not weigh the mass starvation that they undergo in other countries. So they have to quantify what is happening in a country with what is happening to refugees when they're not in the country. Now let's move on to the arguments about the economy that they bring to our contention. They repeatedly say that refugees will take away jobs and because of their work in Jordan. Yet, in fact, according to the New Yorker, the effects of this aren't very large and actually do not incur. In many cases, refugees take up the jobs that natives don't want. According to the Wall Street Journal, if they're looking for empirics, this effort is compounded, and the conditions in Syria have resulted in people forcing to move businesses, resulting in 1,430 registered companies last year, becoming an important actor in the economies of countries such as Turkey and beyond. Accepting more refugees results in them creating better businesses using their expertise, whether they're doctors or whether they set up new businesses that create greater economic revenue, as we've proven through our first source. They see that their source about economic revenue shows a decline in Jordan as of 2013. Our source from 2015 shows that between 2011 and beyond there was actually a growth. It is more modern. It takes into account the new items. So when it comes to weighing this debate, you should look at security, economy, and the threat of terrorism that it poses. When it comes to evaluating the case for morality, we see that the threat to security is in fact greater if refugees are not accepted. When looking at the economy, there is a benefit to host nations into accepting refugees. They actually benefit of them. And then when looking into solvency, we can see that governments actually accepting refugees creates a better overall society. Therefore, it is obvious that on all three of these major fronts, we have already won this debate. Thank you.
The second speaker is ready for talk.
Sure. Okay, so you say that like the Jordanian economy has grown since 2011, right?
Yeah.
So has that growth been caused by refugees?
Yes, by the new businesses they've set up. And we talked about three countries, Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey. We've talked about how they set up new businesses in
Okay,
these
yeah,
countries.
okay. And the evidence of the growth says that all this growth was due to the new business of refugees.
Refugees have resulted in increase. However, your evidence does not prove any such correlation, and only a. Can I continue? Your evidence talks about increases in terrorism. Can you prove on why refugees themselves have resulted in actual increases, not suspected, not possible economic increases that two of your surveys talk about?
What do you mean? Like,
Your refugee.
okay, so like when there's large refugee inflows to a country, it makes it easier not only for terrorists to like infiltrate in these refugee flows, but also like these refugees when they're in the country,
No.
they're more prone to being radicalized.
But that's not what your evidence said. Your evidence said that
Oh,
there's
wait,
a
oh,
pot. Can I continue?
Yeah.
Isn't it true that your evidence said that there's a model that might possibly predict that there's a 91% increase, and there's a possibility of jobs changing, and there is also a suspected and not confirmed. There are no
The
confirmed.
jobs, like, first we give you the example of Paris attack, like one of the terrorist attacks.
Suspected.
What? No,
Suspected. You
it
said
was.
the evidence
It was
itself.
a part of like the refugee inflows, and also actually the evidence of 18% and 91.38%. Like those are like actual studies
These
that prove why like refugee
might.
increases. No,
However,
lead to
refugees.
terrorism.
Can I ask a question?
No,
Isn't it
no,
just?
wait. No, it's
Can
my
I ask
turn.
a question?
It's my turn. Actually.
Okay.
So like you see that radicalization increases like when they're in the Middle East, right? How likely are refugees to be radicalized when they're in these camps?
It is actually increasingly likely, and that is what is actually
Like,
happening.
how
Not,
much?
can I answer?
Yeah.
It is not a suspected issue. It's something that's actually happening right now. And they don't actually go, refugee channels aren't the only sectors in which refugees can go in. As we brought up earlier and you failed to respond to, visas and tourist passport are means of refugees going into countries. It's not just refugees. It's actually a longer
That doesn't
process.
mean, like, you just conceded that refugees actually lead to increase in terrorism?
No,
You
not
said- no, wait.
No, we said
You
that
say that-
there's actually
No,
visas
yeah, wait, no,
which
wait. You
terrorists
say that they're not
infiltrate,
the only
refugees.
ones. Does that mean that they're not? Like you say, there's student visas and tourist visas. We agree. These are also channels for terrorists. However,
So would you
refugees
deny
are
student
also
visas?
channels for terrorists.
So would you
So-
deny student visas?
Like, I wouldn't deny.
Then why are you
student-
denying refugees?
Because that's the topic right now.
See,
Like,
what
we're
the
discuss-
same
We're
increase
discussing
in
the benefits.
terrorism.
Oh, wait, benefits and harms of refugees. If we can prove that refugees result in harm that is terrorism, then like we should like limit them. We're not
Can I
discussing
answer
whether
that
to
question?
debate whether to like decrease student visas or tourist visas. That's literally not the topic. Right
There is
now.
the same potential for terrorism caused by refugees coming in as there is from tourist visas, from student visas coming
I would
into
really like to
countries
see
in
your
Europe.
evidence on that.
Therefore, does not constitute an ability for you to deny refugees, as you do not deny visas. Thank you.
Like that evidence. Like saying like the evidence of like they're like
Yes, before we start a protest.
Which pieces of evidence do you want to see?
like they're equally likely with refugees and with student visas.
We can give you evidence about how. We didn't.
You
We
can
said that
quote
there's
evidence.
if there's a possibility. We didn't quote any evidence.
Oh, you know.
But I'll show you the one we were referring to.
Okay.
The argument we were referring to. We don't have evidence about the equal likelihood, but we have an evidence that there is a likelihood, and you said that there is a likelihood. Okay, I'm sorry.
Okay, it's okay.
It's okay, fine. Then.
However, because judges, are you all ready? Opposing team, are you all ready?
Yeah.
Partner, are you ready? Okay, your time starts now. First of all, the framework is about morality as well as your first contention. As my friend already stated, first of all, there is no justification as to why a government has a moral obligation to accept refugees. Second, we talked about utilitarianism over deontology. And three, we talked about the duty, and they conceded that the duty of the governments is to protect their own citizens. And as we showed, they have been harmed by the influx of refugees. Also, their contention too, they talked about justice and fairness and the fair equality. As we stated, first of all, Rawls talks about governments, how do they have to behave to their own citizens, not about how the governments have to behave between each other. And also, in their contention too, they talked about economic growth. First of all, no quantification whatsoever on the economic growth and how it is related to the influx of refugees. Second, remember, correlation does not imply causation. The fact that the GDP increased while the refugees entered does not mean that the refugees directly affected the increase in GDP. Now, onto our case. First of all, we established the sole contention. The acceptance of refugees threaten the security of the citizens and the nation. And as we established and they conceded, the prime duty of a government is to its own citizens. And as we showed, the citizens are actually being harmed. Once again, our evidence from NYU, a 1% increase in the size of a country's refugee population creates a corresponding 18% increase in terrorist attacks. They say that our evidence is prediction. No, it's actually a study that is based on evidence from the past, as well as our evidence from Arkansas State University that says the refugee influx from the 25th to the 75th percentile creates an expected transnational terrorist attacks increases by 91.38%. And also our backlash. This has been completely answered. Take this into account. The influx of refugees into the countries creates a negative response from the citizens, meaning that the citizens do not oblige and that the government would not have a big accepting their duty. And also, the actual increase of refugees actually harms the refugees, as was already stated, because their houses are being burnt to the ground and they're attacked. They're not even safe in the country. The citizens are not safe in the country, and that is why the countries of the world should not accept refugees.
Okay, go team. You've got 59 seconds of prep. Do you want some?
Yeah, just a bit.
Okay.
So we actually want to-
Roadmap. I'm just pretty much going to go in the exact same order they just went in. So starting with morality. All right. So judges, there's obviously a framework issue right now. So we're going for morality. They're going for utilitarianism. I'm going to say why we went on both. They continuously say that we give no justification for morality, but remember in my first speech, I talked about comparable moral significance. That has not been brought up or rebutted once by the opposing team. Therefore, yes, we have extended to the majority to our what we have to. Why it's morality today. So even if you don't want to go with morality, you want to go for utility. What does the best for the most amount of people? We're doing this. We've proved through economy, and I'll show you a little bit more in their xenophobia argument later. So then they went on to social contract. They're saying that the most important thing is social contract. So if you're going to go with that, then think of what I said about morality in comparable moral significance. They have not even argued to the fact that there weren't, when you vote AF today, we're not doing anything to the social contract. There's not anything of comparable moral significance, and that goes right into economic growth. They just stated in their last speech that we didn't give you evidence on our positive economic growth. We spoke out loud 2 cards, and we showed them the same 2 cards. Therefore, I think we clearly win on economy, which is a huge issue in today's debate. Then they started talking about terrorism. And, security is obviously another big point of debate today, but I think we win on that one also, because when you take in refugees, one, their studies aren't very good to begin. Their NYU study on Equipo really doesn't show where their 18% starts from, and I know this because I have the same card in my computer laptop. And then they were talking, we called them out on the fact that their 91.38 percentage was a model, and then in their last speech she said it was expected of a 91.38%. And also xenophobia. Their whole xenophobia argument falls because racism, like getting your house burned down, is better than getting bombed every single day, having your house infiltrated, your women raped, and your children killed. And that is why we urge a pro ballot.
Is everybody ready for Grand Cross?
I just hit my time.
Okay, so your entire case is predicated on we need to have moral reason to protect human rights, right? Okay. When have you provided evidence that when they are accepted to the countries, their human rights are being respected? When?
We are talking about comparable moral significance. The point that, wait, can we continue?
No, you're not
Can we
answering my
continue?
question.
Can we continue so that we can get to the answer?
Sure.
We are talking about comparable moral significance, an argument that you have repeatedly dropped. The comparable moral significance you fail to quantify because by accepting refugees, they encounter better standards of living, access to basic needs that they do not get elsewhere. Now can we ask a question?
No, wait.
Now can we ask a question? Can we ask that question?
No, what evidence do you have of that?
Okay.
And just, it's unresponded to.
We've already
in my rebuttal,
used it in our first
I
argument.
said
You haven't addressed it yet.
they're-
It was in
they're
our very
still
first
suffering
contention.
from human rights abuses.
John
after they get
Davidson-
accepted. After they get accepted, they still suffer.
However, you have to quantify and compare those exceptions. Now can we ask a
Quantify.
question?
Yeah.
So you repeatedly talk about why Rawls isn't actually there.
Yeah.
You say that Rawls' government is about how a government behaves to its own citizens. Wouldn't you agree that Rawls actually talks about helping others across the world. Wouldn't this comparison transcend national boundaries?
Here's something. Basically, in your rebuttal, you say that we have to compare the failures of the government or the bad crisis situation of the government to the crisis outside. You conceded previously that the duty of a government is to its citizens, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so why should the governments of the countries of the world prioritize or even care about the situation of the refugees when their duties to their own citizens?
Because of the direct economic benefit that we have provided.
But
and
okay,
through
you
our,
said that it's direct, right?
Yes.
Okay, but you never
We
said.
did. We used
No,
the
wait a
quote from
second.
the
Let
New
me
York
finish.
Times.
Let me finish. Basically you said refugees came in, the GDP increased, right?
Through the creation of 1,230 businesses.
Okay, here's the thing. You're not showing how that creation of those businesses actually leads to that 1%. Weren't there other factors that led to the increase? Was that the only factor that led to the increase in the GDP?
You can't isolate factors when you talk about GDP. You look at the
Exactly,
overall benefit.
exactly. So
And
you
we have
cannot
shown
say
that there's an
refugees
overall
are
benefit.
actually the ones
Can we
who
ask you a follow-up question
Yeah.
regarding
Yes.
that matter? You talk about direct causation, yet you've only provided statistical models for the possible direct increase in terrorism. Can you provide any instance in which there has been increased overall general terrorism, not isolated events, caused by refugee influxes?
Like those studies, like they're based, like the actually study constantly
We've already argued
like
it.
it's based in 2005, like refugee
2005?
flows.
So
But it's
2005,
based on
after
these
there were no refugees
wait.
accepted
The-
into the Middle East.
these
Just to
ac-
clarify.
No. There's the association from the actual refugee flows. Like, it's not like just this random model that you like try to explain. Okay, so you say that like in response. Oh wait, again to the.
Would you like to rephrase your answer?
That's time.
Just kidding.
And the con team has a minute and 1 second to prep.
Yeah, we would like to see it.
Okay.
Okay, so it's gonna be defense from their summary, and then voters. Okay. Let's start off on morality. They never respond to the 3 dealings I put on their case in rebuttal. Governments are not moral agents, which entire aim is better for governments specifically, and governments have an obligation to their own citizens first. Don't weigh morality in this round because they drop all the responses I make to it. Then, like, remember, no justification for morality, so you don't weigh it. And then on, like, they say they clearly win on the economy. However, they don't respond to the evidence I gave in rebuttal from the IMF, who tells you that causally, the influx of refugees has increased inflation due to the increase in rent prices, and also increased the informal sector, which has resulted in a decrease in tax revenues and a decrease in work conditions, and it has also led to like more strains on infrastructure. And then on the terrorism index, they say that the studies are not very good because 91 to 38% is a model. Even if it's a model, it's still like models real life, like you turn away. And then on Egi, it's based on real life refugee inflows, so it's still valid. Now voters. First, terrorism. Remember the warrant. It's easier for terrorists to infiltrate a country with more refugee inflows. And then when these refugees enter a country, they become more prone to radicalization. They try to respond by saying like there's also radicalization in the Middle East. They fail to quantify like, how much they're likely they're to be radicalized. So you don't wait. Now, actually, had 2 main impacts which I already responded to. And first, Amanda Egi going with you. So the 1% increase in the refugee population increases terrorism attacks by 18%. And Milton tells you that the increase from 25 to 70% of refugees increases transnational terrorism by 91.38%. Now, on weighing. This is the only direct quantifiable link to lives in today's round because they provide exactly 0 evidence of solvency even though we constantly ask for it. That means we outweigh on 3 levels. And the first is on irreversibility, because once you lose a life, you can't get it back. And second is on magnitude, because we're showing a 91.38% increase in terrorism after you attack refugees. And then third on prerequisite, because without a life, nothing is possible. Thank you.
Okay, co-team, you have 18 seconds.
The framework issue, then the 2 issues of security and economy, and then finally how we can weigh this debate. So my time begins now. So let's look at the 2 frameworks that have been provided today. The first is social contract and the second is morality. We have won already on both. In terms of morality, we have proved the comparable moral significance that is achieved through helping refugees. We have proved the Rawlsian idea of helping those beyond your nation, and we have proved why that needs to be done by states. We have proved that that is a realistic outlook, and they have failed to object against that. Now, on the social contract, we have proved why there is actually a benefit to economies when refugees occur, and we have proved why there's also a benefit to the refugees themselves, because we have actually weighed this against. So now let's look at how we're weighing the evidence and why our evidence ultimately trumps them in order to fulfill these burdens. So in terms of economy, they've reset an IMF evidence, yet don't respond to the fact that this evidence itself is outdated from 2013 and does not accommodate for the inflows as our evidence does. Now on terrorism, they used Equipo from 2005, which was talking about refugee inflows increasing terrorism. However, in 2005, the inflows of refugees were incomparable to the inflows that occur today, as we've already stated in Cross-X. They say that it's easier to infiltrate, well, yet they themselves fail to weigh the infiltration that occurs with refugees with visas and other ways of coming into a country. They themselves admit that they would not cancel visas if they did increase risk for terrorism, and yet they would cancel refugees if there was this equal risk, if there was a risk for terrorism. By using risk as something that they can selectively choose to adhere against in the social contract, they've already lost on their own point, and we have won. So now on these two frameworks, we have won. But let's look to the new directly quantifiable links that they have just brought up. Irreversibility. There is an irreversible damage to the radicalization of refugees in the Middle East. We have proven that the damage is comparable to the terrorism threat in a host country. The magnitude of these threats is comparable. They say that we have to look at the radicalization that occurs within a country. Yeah, we have proven already that this radicalization occurs outside. They have not responded. Then finally, the prerequisite of living. It is impossible to do that when refugees are undergoing intense harms. Therefore, on all three of these contentions, we've already won this debate, and we have won both on security and on economy when you weigh social contract and morality. Thank you.